Well, hello, everybody, and welcome back to Cookie Pocket. This is episode 122. I am your host, Zach, and I'm joined with my usual co-hosts, Christian and Mitchell, but this time we have a fourth host, our third guest host of Season 5, and a returning guest host at that. Would you care to introduce yourself, guest host?
Hello, yes, I'm Sam. I'm a friend.
Yeah, Sam and I have worked together on a lot of different projects. Sam has shot quite a lot of stuff for me at this point. She shot the Heath portion of The Search for Alexander. So if any of our listeners contributed to that project, Sam's camera is where your money went. Sam's eye behind the lens.
And I thank you.
Nice. Yeah. And for long-time listeners, Sam also guested last season on our Hour of the Wolf episode. And she's returned for quite a different film, because this time we are talking about Shallow Grave. This is the directorial debut of Danny Boyle, who is kind of one of England's treasured directors, I would say. He's directed things like 28 Days Later, Slumdog Millionaire, Steve Jobs, 127 Hours. He's kind of a stylistic chameleon, but this is the port from which he set sail. And it's a fairly typical kind of crime thriller narrative, at least in the way that it's set up. The concept is that there are three roommates, Alex, David, and Juliet. I didn't consult the Wikipedia for those names. And they're looking for a fourth roommate to live in their flat. They've rejected quite a few people, but they bring on this new mysterious guy named Hugo. But no sooner has Hugo moved into the flat than he drops dead, presumably of a drug overdose. And before they can call the police, the three roommates find a briefcase full of money in his apartment. And so the typical plot begins. What do we do with the body, and what do we do with the money? But let's not beat around the bush. Let's start with general thoughts like we always did. What did you guys think of Shallow Grave? Anyone can begin.
I'll dive into the shallow end, I guess. I was very excited to watch this. I'm glad that you chose it, Zach, because Danny Boyle's been on my short list for a long while. I think we all have probably different levels of familiarity with him. The only film of his I'd seen before this was Yesterday, the sort of Beatles-centric comedy of a few years ago, which I guess kind of has mixed reactions, but I enjoyed it at the time. And I knew that he had this sort of varied background and a bunch of films with Ewan McGregor, who I like and know most prominently from Star Wars. So I thought, okay, great. And I did mostly enjoy this. I quickly understood why this is a very Zach-friendly film. And I mean that in a good way.
Yeah.
I think a couple seasons ago, Mitchell kind of distilled our varying interests as you're very concerned with sort of the aesthetics of filmmaking, whereas I'm often more concerned with characters and story. And I don't know if this is necessarily a great example of aesthetic, but I think it's a good example of taking the viewer in unexpected ways. Not just from the first 10 or 15 minutes feeling like this very enjoyable comedy and then switching to this very dark thriller, but also this streak of unpredictability leading all the way to the end. I think at some point it goes a little bit too far for me. Like 2 minutes from the ending, I was like, "Ooh, I don't like that. This is a 2.5." And then it kind of worked its way back up to a 3 in like the last 30 seconds. So, but I like all the actors here. I had a lot of fun with it, especially the beginning, as I alluded to. This was a 3 out of 5. And I'm excited to see more Danny Boyle now, and glad that I started here, this being his early work.
Well, I was treading on the 3.5 range, and I was thinking to myself about all the times that Zach posts his review, and then Christian posts his review, and then mine always ends up being in the middle. But this time I did not let it happen, and I truly did believe this was a 3 out of 5. I think it's very stylistic, and I do think there is a lot of director innovation and involvement in this. I feel like there's a inherent momentum that was with 28 Days Later that feels frantic and it's somewhat economic, I guess, with how long scenes play out for, and pretty blunt with major plot points unfolding. And this film definitely oozes with that the entire time. I like the scale of it, and I like how I like the reprehensibility of the characters, and also the way that they interact with each other, even though that they all agreed on the same thing. They kind of become chaotic and psychotic at the same time, just because of one simple event. And I think that's a neat concept. And I just think in this case, it definitely felt like there wasn't a lot to latch onto in terms of character development. It felt like I really didn't have any reason to root for anybody. And it's not like a movie has to have people we're rooting for, or it has to have a conflict with a good and a bad side or anything. It's perfectly fine to have like everybody be terrible in some way, or have some like have the police as the authority and then everyone else is doing something bad, or we've seen those kinds of mock-ups when it comes to having character relationships and stuff. But I just think it felt too frantic, and it felt like there was too much emphasis on the black comedy kind of taking over everything and kind of pushing the plot forward, because I appreciated it and it didn't necessarily feel out of place, I would say. It just felt like it was propelling the plot forward too quickly, and felt like I wasn't really being given enough time with the characters besides just like writing them off, I guess, is kind of what it feels like. I think I felt like I was writing them off, and I really like the story. I like how the story played out. The plot is great. I really don't have a lot of criticism about it. I just feel as though there wasn't really a commitment to keeping these characters around for that long. It felt brisk to a fault, and that's why I gave it a 3 out of 5.
Okay. Huh.
Yeah, in terms of ratings, I hadn't like mentally given it like a blank out of 5.
Yeah.
I think because I was really wrapped up in watching it as like a filmmaker, if that makes sense. Like looking at shots and going, oh, I've seen Zach like recreate this shot, or looking at their lighting and being like, oh, this looks like it was shot on a stage, and like that took me out of the narrative a bit. But in the very beginning, I was very wrapped up in the narrative. But I'll agree with Mitchell that the characters, like by the end, I felt very detached from them. I don't know if it was that I hadn't spent enough time with them, or if they were too like plot heavy. But by the end, I was like, I don't really feel the characters at this point. Like, I don't feel sympathetic for them, which I don't necessarily think you're supposed to be like, oh, these are good people I'm rooting for.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel super involved in the ends of their narratives. But that being said, as watching it from a filmmaker's perspective, I really, really enjoyed it. I thought just some of the setups were just incredible. Their production design was really cool. And the writing was almost, the dialogue in particular was almost witty to a fault, but it was fun. So I don't know. I think it would settle around like a 3 out of 5 for me. Like, I don't know if I'll return to it for a good time, but I'll return to it to put it on like a mood board.
Sure. Yeah, I think 3 out of 5 is a really fair rating for this. I personally give it a 4 because I really appreciate the stylistic elements and kind of the directorial vision. But I do think you can tell it's a first movie. It does feel kind of small scale, and it does feel a little jumbled, and like there's a lot of ideas in play. But I will agree that I think the production design is really great and does a lot in kind of making a very small story feel bigger and more dramatic. Most of the scenes in this take place in the flat. But the way that they design each room, there's different colors in every room and a different kind of mood and feel to every room in the apartment. So those scenes aren't just interior flat, they're interior kitchen, interior loft, interior bedroom, and the whole space feels expansive and feels like a whole world. And kind of watching it, at first I thought, am I going to complain about the size of this apartment? Because these are meant to be young people. But additionally, when you think about their jobs, they're not actually that young, and they are a doctor, an accountant, and I mean, journalist is the only one who might not be pulling his weight there. But I mean, doctor and accountant, I can believe that they would get this very big apartment. It's a film that I really enjoy, and every time I watch it I wonder, is this my favorite Danny Boyle movie? And then I see another Danny Boyle movie and I go, is this my favorite Danny Boyle movie? He's a director who has different strengths that come up in every film. Something that I think we all kind of mentioned though, so something I want to touch back on in more detail, is the ending, and how, at least for the three of you, the ending was kind of maybe a question mark. Maybe it didn't resolve everything in the best way. Christian, in your Letterboxd review, so since it's written down, it's something I just want to follow up on and maybe springboard for everybody else. You mentioned and also alluded to here how you felt that the film eventually became almost unpredictable to a fault. And I'm curious if you could elaborate on that. And I'm also wondering, Sam and Mitchell, if you guys had a similar reaction by the conclusion.
I think the breaking point for me is probably when what's her name? Oh my gosh.
Juliet.
When Juliet stabs Alex.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was, and I guess the messaging or the point there is that they're all kind of corrupted by this money or this situation equally, because I feel like to that point, she definitely had fewer egregious moments than the guys. But where I then say it won me back is the reveal where she's like leaving and then she opens it and the money's hidden under the boards, and Alex had this whole plan the whole time. I think that's a clever little double twist. And to sort of pair it on what Mitchell was saying earlier, I think this is like maybe the only time on the podcast I've ever preferred a movie not to be only 90-ish minutes long. I really would have been happy to have like 20 to 30 more minutes, maybe even before the death of Hugo and the thriller pivot, especially because the beginning is so enjoyable when they're just riffing off of each other and mocking Cameron, of course. And even if I don't get a strong sense of them as individuals or really their careers, you mentioned what they all do, Zach, but I didn't feel like that was often a point of focus. I do feel like you get a strong sense of their interactions and at least their dynamic as a trio. Letterboxd is often filled with reviews of people being quippy or lustful after the stars.
Quippy or lustful, that's true.
There's that one scene where Juliet like steps on Alex, and yes, that is kind of an admittedly exciting and fun scene. So there are moments like that are great.
Christian said it first.
Okay, settle down, kids. But I still think there needs to be more in the way of specific motivation or clarifying what it is that drove them to this point. Like maybe being a journalist is what pushes you to kill for money, but I feel like there just wasn't a ton of specificity there for me.
I think that also brings up another interesting question that maybe we should consider is, I think there's two different ways you can look at kind of the central plot of this movie as about a friend group that's corrupted by the presence of this money, which results in this greed, which brings out the worst in them. Or is it about a friend group that's kind of already corrupt, that is destined to eat itself eventually, and the money is just a catalyst? I think that's an interesting thing to consider as well.
Good counter, Zach. You've got me on my toes again.
I think you're getting too much out of this, Zach. I think it's more simple than that. I totally agree with Christian having more time with the characters. I think the meaningful time we would have with them would be pretty much what Christian said, like seeing their deterioration, like seeing how it affects their lives more. Because ultimately I feel like you have to have a choice where you can't have zany, goofy, like Christian said in his review, like Seinfeld-y type characters. Like this almost does feel like a sitcom or something. It's like one episode where they kill somebody and they have to cover it up and they find out they're alive the whole time or something, right?
Yep.
And that's kind of what it feels. But there's somebody that's dead, you know. So it's hard to feel both ways about it. Like you can have a black humor film that has these three characters going crazy and turning on each other and everything. But I just feel like most of the scenes we had with them were quips or like random stupid things they do. Like Alex always watching the TV at really weird shows on the TV. Or just like, I feel like David, we had a lot more of a progression with. I feel like even though he was pretty abrupt with it, it makes a lot more sense because he actually was the one that took apart the body and buried it and everything. And that's pretty realistic. We don't really get the reactions out of Alex or Juliet at all. We hear them talk about it a little bit, but it feels like there's more things happening to them than there's enough time for them to react to it or us see their character progression. We kind of just go based off of assumption that eventually they're going to reach this conflict and eventually they're going to have to resolve it and somebody's going to have to get out of this alive. Is pretty much by the halfway point, I would say, is the perspective. But yeah, I feel like David was a better example of somebody who had more of a progression.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I necessarily think I needed more time with the characters or even more like meaningful scenes with them. And the more I think about it, I think the reason I felt so detached from them comes from watching them from like an analytical perspective on like their psychology. Because I spent a lot of the film thinking about how they start out very self-centered and, well, at least Alex and Juliet start out very self-centered and they all seem to think they're the main character of this little trio. And I think they are corrupted before it starts. I think they're presented right away as if everything's all good and happy and the money corrupts them. But I think especially as the story comes out between Juliet's romantic entanglements with either of the men, it kind of reveals itself that they've been having issues. They've always been destined to fall apart one way or another. So I don't know that I needed more time with them. I felt like every scene with them kind of revealed a little bit more about their psyche. Like even the TV stuff with Alex, I thought was interesting because I felt like the shows he was watching were an insight into what was going on in his head. So I don't know that I necessarily needed more time with them. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you, Sam, that I do think that the money is kind of just a catalyst to their friend group kind of eating itself from the inside out. Because you see, even at the beginning, when they aren't kind of exerting their malice outward at people who are applying to be their fourth roommate, they immediately kind of turn inward on David, and he becomes the next one in the pecking order. And as soon as David were to move out or something, I'm sure that Juliet or Alex, one of them would become the next one who gets ground down to a nub. And I think the money just kind of creates a chaos in that situation. Christian, you mentioned that it didn't feel to you by the ending that Juliet had necessarily kind of developed the instability to kind of like, or the greed to like stab Alex, because there's not as much of her kind of acting out for the money. I kind of think that maybe in her actions, that's not especially true, but I think there is some, because I've seen this maybe 3 or 4 times. This past time watching it for the podcast, I feel like her sort of reaction to the money comes out in her pitting Alex and David against each other. I think there is kind of some Lady Macbething going on here, because there's that one scene where after David's gone up into the loft and he's living up there now on his mattress, there's a point where Alex doesn't want to go up there to see if the money's there, and she says like, "Oh, well, you're stronger than him," and it does very much seem like a ploy to just get him to go up there, and if they get rid of each other, well, more money for me. But that brings up an interesting point, I think, about David, who I think is the one we see most impacted by the money. And I'm curious as to whether we were convinced by his kind of heel turn, his turn to professional killer who hacks up two people and chucks them out of the loft. Were we convinced by kind of that change in him? Did that feel natural or at least convincing?
I think so. I think the second that Alex has this idea to pull straws, I'm just like, oh man, this is not going to go well, and someone's going to be traumatized so badly by this. And that cut after David pulls the straw and he says, I can't do it, and then it cuts to him doing it. That's so good, man. That's so effective. And like Mitchell said, I think it makes the most sense for him to have this rapid deterioration. And if we see the sequence of that less, I think we see the consequences a lot more and sort of endure over time. What with the drilling the holes in the floor of the loft / ceiling of the apartment. And like these weird scenes where he's like, it seems like he's about to drill Alex's freaking head, and then he like smiles and laughs about it. That instability is played really well by Eccleston, who I much preferred here to the last film we discussed. Which
Second appearance by Christopher Eccleston in this season. He also played John Lennon in Lennon Naked, which we talked about earlier this season. Yeah.
And with this sort of allusion to Seinfeldian characters, I don't mean that as necessarily a criticism of the type of characters they are, because I mean, first of all, I love Seinfeld. But, secondly, I think there certainly is this type of like this mold of person who is outwardly very charming and gregarious, but perhaps manipulative and also very needy, the way Zach described this like pecking order of attacking the person lower than them. And like the idea of Seinfeld being that the humor comes from those characters being actually basically bad people in their lives. This is maybe a darker riff on that, but I still think it broadly works. And I think that there are people like that, perhaps a lot of people like that in the real world. They maybe don't all agree to kill someone and then fight over the money. But I do think there are a lot of opportunistic and ambitious people that behave like that.
I do think, because Sam touched on this, but them having like certain levels of insanity before they actually kill him, bury him. I think like Alex pretty much comes across as unhinged right away. And Juliet is kind of feeding off of it. Whereas like David's unhinged in that he's like barely holding on to this level of morality. It's like a very thinly veiled sense of morality. And you kind of see it like him slowly cracking, like with Christian mentioning Eccleston's character. I think he had definitely the most nuance. But yeah, I would say like even Alex feels like such a static character the whole time. And maybe that's kind of purposeful, but he actually does feel like he's going along with whatever. And Juliet's character is more based off of how she's playing off of what they're doing. And I mean, it's a character dynamic, but it's you definitely have to suspend disbelief, I think. And that's to be expected, obviously, with this type of genre, but I think it goes a little bit too far for me.
Okay.
I think their characters, in particular David's, are believable for me. I think David's kind of break in his psyche is very clear. Like the moment he's dismembering that corpse and you hear him like hurl, it's like, oh no. And I think like a couple scenes after that, I was like watching this with Connor and I turned to him and I was like, I can't wait for that man to snap. Because like you could just feel it coming, you know? So I think it was set up in a way that made it very believable when he really started to lose it. And I think the other characters also felt like their next moves were in line with who they were. To Mitchell's point about them like changing as characters or being static, I don't really know. I think they might be pretty static because I think they start out nuts. So, yeah.
Yeah, I definitely agree that for me, like I totally buy David's shift. And I think the moment where because throughout the whole movie we see these two criminals, these two thugs who are looking for the money. They're locking people in freezers and drowning people in bathtubs. We don't really know why they're looking for it. We just know they're looking for the money. And they show up at the apartment and they go up in the loft and David kills both of them. And I do think that's a surprise, but it doesn't feel like it shouldn't happen. It does feel like by this point, David could be at that point. And I think they do a great job of kind of visually representing in the moment when they get rid of the bodies, his kind of full transformation. Because when he goes back out to the woods and he gets rid of both of those bodies too, and this is kind of a shot similar to, there's a shot very similar to this in Goodfellas, but he's in the hole kind of sawing their limbs off, and he's lit by the brake lights with the mist, and it looks like an image straight out of hell. And you can see kind of the full descent of David from this meek little accountant to ghoulish body snatcher in just one frame. And I think that's very effective. Something we've kind of talked about quite a bit in this last question was the genre. And so I am curious what you guys thought this movie was, because it's kind of described as a black comedy thriller. And a lot of reviews that are like on the poster, and I think even the log line describes it as a laugh a minute. But when I watch this, I think like there are some funny lines, but I don't really see that much full-on comedy in it. So I was curious how you guys kind of came away thinking about the film in terms of genre.
I think there's more of an abrupt shift.
Why don't we have Sam begin?
Sam.
We're shaking up the order this time.
Okay. I was going to say, in the first, like 10 minutes, I'm buying it as a black comedy. But as soon as they find Hugo, I'm like, this is just a thriller. Like, I would no longer put black comedy on it because I feel like that's misleading for the entirety of the film. Yeah. If you just watch the first 10 minutes, that's a fine title. I don't know how much more specific I'd get past thriller. Crime thriller. Yeah,
I do think as soon as you see a full frontal nude corpse, it does kind of cease to be in the comedy genre and starts. I thought that was kind of funny. Yeah, well,
he's posed pretty funny.
What did you think about it, Mitchell? Yeah,
I guess it depends on how dark your humor gets. I didn't want to say how black your comedy gets, but it does. It's a gray area. It's gray comedy, because
nice save.
I do think. Thank you. Yeah, I do think. I think once you induce enough thrills, I can see why the black comedy moniker kind of fades away. I would definitely agree with Sam and say it's a thriller first. I think it has an air and a style to it that accepts comedic elements, but that doesn't sound very good on the movie poster or in the Wikipedia description. So, yeah, I think I would agree and just call it a thriller.
Okay.
Yeah, I pretty much agree. There's this big shift about 10 or 15 minutes in. Even the sort of semi-recurring joke of Cameron, Alex sees Cameron at this event and pretends to, or calls him and then says that he didn't call him just to humiliate him. And then even that ends up with Alex getting sucker punched by Cameron in the bathroom later. So I feel like that's a pretty straightforward refutation of the idea that the film is a comedy, even if it's marketed that way.
Yeah, I think that it's hard to describe. I feel like the way the movie's constructed is almost comedic and kind of is like wryly chuckling at itself. But I don't know if I would call that a full-on comedy. Like the decision to end the movie on the song that they do, which is this big bombastic song about friendship after David's dead, Alex is pinned to the floor, and Juliet is surely going to be arrested or on the run for the rest of her life. That clearly is kind of a sardonic moment, but I don't necessarily know if that's comedy. It's more kind of the movie chuckling at its own evil ways, I guess. Yeah, I do think it would be. I'm not a big genre label person because I feel like if you want to make a movie that does whatever you want it to do, you should be able to make that and not worry about the tag. But I do think that if I gave this to somebody and went, it's a laugh-a-minute comedy, they would never speak to me again.
I will amend my answer a little bit because, like, I agree, it's not a laugh a minute, but it was so absurd and horrifying that I found myself laughing a lot.
Okay.
So I'll give it that. On the whole, I do agree genre is like a marketing thing and like an academia way of like categorizing things. But there was a point where Alex gets punched in the face after harassing that kid again. And Connor, he's laughing now, lost it. So maybe that's what they mean.
Maybe, yeah. Well, that's kind of the major stuff that I wanted to discuss. But any other points about the film that I haven't brought up that we wanted to talk about?
I'll add on to the production because I really liked. I don't know anything about cameras at all, right? Christian remembers the banger we had in history class when we set up the camera and the airplanes went over every 5 seconds. That's maximum amount of footage. And the Much Ado About Nothing skit, that was the other one. Everything else, yes. Which Zach cameoed in.
These high school deep cuts.
Yes, high school deep cuts. I would say that the panning down to show the money and also show Alex in there during his nightmare, and obviously having the attic be a pretty major part of the plot and of a lot of things. And also having those perspective shots from the ceiling, I think were some of my favorite shots in the whole film. Just it really felt like a full on world, like you said, Zach, and it felt like there was so much that could happen. They honestly could do a lot with that. Like that felt like such a well-developed place that it almost became iconic in its own right. And they really didn't need to go a whole lot of many other places. So I just thought it was an extremely well shot, a very well produced area, and all the different like visual motifs and the drums and the stuffed monkey that moves around, like all that stuff was like, wink and a nod things if you're like really paying attention. So I really appreciated those.
I am glad you mentioned the final moment with the floorboards, because something I did want to bring up, I didn't think it was substantive enough to be its own question, but apparently the very ending during some test screenings where the police come in and they see Alex and he's pinned to the floor, despite the fact that Alex kind of smiles and looks up at the police, there were audience members who thought that he was meant to be dead in that moment, and that was just kind of like
dummies.
which is why they added the line where he actually talks to the police, because in that moment that's ADR, you just see the back of his head and you hear him say hello inspector or something like that. And when I read about that, I thought, really, I've never read it that way. I'm guessing none of us thought, oh well, he's dead until he said hello.
I did have that moment, actually.
Okay.
I know it makes me sound silly, but there was a moment where I was like, because I think the thing that got me is David's narration from like the morgue, where I thought maybe Alex was laughing from beyond the grave, and this is how they were communicating it. But I was like, when I saw the money, I was like, oh no, he's still alive. Like this is him winning. But I did have that moment where I was like, is this happening?
I think before he laughed, I think when the stabbing actually happened, I thought he was dead or would imminently die. I'm not sure at what point that illusion was broken for me. So to be fair, I guess I was a dummy 20% of the way too. I don't know. I think it's interesting to hear the test screening thing about Danny Boyle, because I have like a short yesterday tangent, if that's okay, Zach.
Sure. Yes.
So in the marketing, in the first trailer for Yesterday, there's a scene where Himesh Patel's character, his name is slipping my mind, he's on James Corden's talk show and he plays something for Ana de Armas. And in the final film, Ana de Armas is cut, which is, if you know me, you know I like Star Wars, The Beatles, and I'm upset that she was cut from Yesterday.
Yes.
But it's just interesting to hear that he also took test screening advice for this film, because as I was watching it, I was thinking, okay, this is his first film. This has like the hallmarks of an independent production. this feels, and a lot of unpredictable, potentially choices that would alienate the audience from the characters are made here. And he said the reason they cut De Armas from Yesterday is because audiences found Patel's character less likable because he was sort of flirting with cheating on Lily James or something. So it's just interesting to hear, maybe it's a genre thing, but to hear his priorities with how he wants his characters perceived change over time.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because I think even though in this movie, and we're kind of treading water into other Danny Boyle movies at this point, but I agree that there are choices made in this film that alienate the audience from the characters. But I think the least successful and the least good Danny Boyle movies are bad because of entirely different reasons. Which are also kind of present here. We talked about how there's kind of a lot going on thematically and stylistically. And I think the worst of his movies kind of go a step too far into that. Maybe someday I'll bring A Life Less Ordinary onto the show and we'll all have a good cry. I don't know.
Oh, no.
Well, alrighty. I mean, if that's... Oh, no, Sam, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I'm really... anti-changing your movie or your book or whatever to make your characters more likable. I just thought I'd throw that out there. I'm really on a kick with unsalvageable lead characters right now.
Yeah.
Oh, that does remind me. You mentioned the morgue shot, Sam, and this is just some other... I do kind of like that the framing device of the film is David on a slab. I think that is a very neat device. But another thing that I read about was apparently Christopher Eccleston was terrified to be shut up inside a morgue. So Danny Boyle had to hire an extra to like be in the cabinet above him and to basically go, "It's all right. You're not alone. Like, the crew's coming," which I think is kind of a very funny visual.
He is John Lennon.
But already, I mean, if that's everything we had to discuss, we can move on to the rundown. For those who are joining the show for the first time, the rundown is our longest running segment that we've had on the show, other than the core discussion. Essentially, Christian, Mitchell, and Sam will take turns hurling random terms and jokes and gags from the film at me for 1 minute, and I will give them all a rating out of 5, which is entirely arbitrary and meaningless, but hopefully a bit of fun.
I sometimes think there are nuggets of meaning.
It's got meaning in there. It's got meaning.
I know you like to cut us off at the heel, but okay. And we'll go in the order Zach just said. So we'll go, or no, Zach said Christian, Mitchell, and Sam. We'll go Mitchell, Christian, Sam.
I go first.
Mitchell, Christian, Sam. Yeah. Mitchell's the tone setter. Okay.
Tone
and
set.
3, 2, 1, go.
Edinburgh speedrun.
3 out of 5.
Presence.
4 out of 5.
Charisma.
3 out of 5.
Style.
4 out of 5.
Charm.
3 out of 5.
Not today, thank you.
2 out of 5.
Freebasing from time to time.
2 out of 5.
Sounding Swedish because you're emotional.
4 out of 5.
Getting treated for the human condition.
4 out of 5.
The briefcase.
4 out of 5.
Sour cream and onion Pringles.
3 out of 5.
PC Plod saves Harry the hamster from House of Horror.
5 out of 5.
Zach is squeamish Christopher Eccleston.
4 out of 5.
Zach has child-hating Ewan McGregor.
4 out of 5.
Raising money to put down children.
4 out of 5.
Love and happiness forever.
3 out of 5.
Getting sucker punched by Cameron.
4 out of 5.
Telling your mate to swallow.
2 out of 5.
Some funny bank and funny place.
4 out of 5.
We'll count that last one.
You know, I really didn't mean to give that line to you, Sam. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. I saw that one come up and I was like, yep.
Yep.
Well, okay, we're coming to the end of this episode. I feel like it's been a bit of a short one, but this is kind of a short and sweet film, so maybe that's appropriate. Sam, thank you so much for being on the show with us today. Is there anything at all that you'd like to plug or?
You know what? You can follow me on Instagram at Samantha Giordano. And that's it. That's all I've got.
Nice.
Well, that'll be in the description under the YouTube version of this episode of the podcast for those who are listening right now. Next time, I think it's Christian hosting. Christian, do you want to give us a tease of what our next episode's going to be?
Sure. Oh, my dog is barking. Oh, dear. Because she knows I'm teasing an intense movie. We're talking about 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri next time, a Martin McDonagh film. I've not seen it. The only film of his I've seen is Banshees, his most recent, which I enjoyed. And this is just one that's been on my list forever. And I thought, well, let's throw it on the podcast. It seems like it'll be fun to discuss. All I know is that it's about a murder case, and it stars a lot of people I like, including Zach's beloved Sam Rockwell. So yeah, come join us, and we'll talk about good times and bad.
Yeah, I have seen this movie, but it was before I was kind of seriously thinking about or writing my thoughts on movies. So I'm intrigued to revisit it, because even then I thought that wasn't as good as I wanted it to be. So I'm curious if that'll be the same now. So tune in next time if you'd like to hear our thoughts on 3 Billboards Outside Ebbing, Missouri. Thank you again, Sam, for being here. We have been Cookie Pocket. Good night.